So thanks for joining us, everyone. It's been a busy couple of weeks for KlimatX. We've got to the stage where we've been able to say that we were able to announce that we did what we said we were going to do. We took our initial investment, we developed these projects all the way through to the sort of late stages of project validation and development, actually prior to the issuance of the project design documents, and we're able to announce that we've completed our first commercial pre-purchase transaction with a large Fortune 100 company. And we will be able to announce the name of that company at some point. It's really just a function of their PR machine and their PR department catching up with all of the work and announcing it at the best possible time. So very pleased to be able to say that what we were able to do in the kind of carbon credit ecosystem was go from the origination of an idea, sourcing a project, and then de-risking it with a couple of $1 million of investment into the country and into the site. And then our model going forwards is that the pre-purchase agreement funds the balance of the CapEx on the project, so it pays for all of the replanting work over the next 2.5 years. We repay that with tons at a very favorable price, so about the first 10 to 12% of the tons that the project produces. And then the investor, the pre-purchaser, has an option to purchase the balance of the tons produced from the project site at an index price, probably using the Platts carbon index. So something that really reflects the current price of private transactions for very high quality projects. So it gives us very high certainty over our production, over our investment. It gives us a lot of control over the next 2 to 3 years, regardless of what happens in the market. And it gives us very high certainty about the pricing that we're getting for this project. So this first 5,000 hectares over the contract period of 20 years will produce between 1.6 and 1.9 million tons. If we use sort of conservative price escalators for carbon pricing starting at our current prices, we expect that's going to be worth over $110 million over the lifespan of the project. The investor has also got a right of first offer, which we expect they will take for the balance of the 20,000 hectares, so 25,000 in total. So they can trigger that. They can continue investing and expanding the project area. And we feel very comfortable with the idea. We have a single investor that works across one of our sort of contiguous areas, as opposed to having to slice these up, given that the pricing is driven by a market index. So we're not heavily discounting anything. So that's the great news. That's sort of the last 12 months of work for the company, validating that we can do this, that we can deliver, challenging the myth that's circulating at the moment that demand for carbon credits has fallen away because of other distractions. We're seeing very, very strong buying interest from the 16 different groups that we had in the data room. We've been engaged with most of the trading houses, so Mercuria, Macquarie, Hartree, Vitol at different stages. But frankly, what we found is the large corporates are giving us the best terms, the longest contract periods, and the best support on the buy side, at least for now. So from this jumping off point, from this major milestone for the company, having validated this model, our goal now is to expand that effort to cover the additional 32,000 hectares in Sierra Leone we have under contract. I was just on a call this morning where we're looking through the draft PDD for the mangrove restoration and conservation projects. So we expect that to come to market soon. We've made tremendous progress in Yucatan with our mangrove restoration projects, working with the state government and the federal government there. We've had 2 field trips in Suriname now, looking at mangrove restoration projects there. Really interesting project type where if we re-establish tidal flows, we eliminate methane from the system by driving up the salinity levels back to natural levels. And that gives us potentially a very large scale carbon credit project, because we're eliminating methane that would otherwise go into the atmosphere. So again, across all of those project models, our approach is develop them, de-risk, and then take them to the wholesale buyers in the market and have them share the risk and the cost with us of funding project development. And that's in contrast to an approach where we'd work with streamers or with intermediaries. It's in contrast to an approach where we'd have to use debt or equity or project finance to develop the projects. these pre-purchase models give us a lot of certainty with very little risk, no debt to service, and you know, a manageable cost profile. And in this rapidly growing market, that frees us up to take our equity and invest it into expanding the other project areas. So very strong proof of concept, really strong pipeline for the business, looking at somewhere around 45 million tons of projects in the pipeline to date. And that's without including expansion within Sierra Leone or even any of the details of the Suriname project. So I expect before the end of the year, we'll be looking at least 100 million tons of project development under management. Some other kind of highlights just in terms of where we're going, and we've announced some of this already, but you know, we've taken a very responsible and prudent approach to the development of the projects in terms of revenue sharing agreements and environmental attributes. So we'll be launching an ESG and impact strategy over the summer that describes in a lot more detail how our projects work, and how we support both carbon production but also biodiversity credits. That's very important to us. Turns out to be very important to our large buyers as well. We're also looking at how we incorporate satellite data and information and drone flights into project monitoring. So, you know, there'll come a time within a year or two where you could come to the KlimatX site and see almost daily satellite coverage of the project areas. We think that kind of assurance is really important for buyers. It's also really important for our own sake in terms of managing these projects. And yeah, just generally great coverage from the markets, great coverage from analysts in a time that I think we all agree is pretty difficult for public companies. So I'll pause there in terms of a quick introduction, because I know I want to dedicate as much time as possible to Q&A in this session.
Yeah, we do have some if you want to get right into that, James.
Yeah, let's just do that, Julie. That'd be great.
Okay. We had a question here from Hamish. Given the high cost of certification of reforested land, what would KlimatX consider the smallest area of a land that would be financially economical worth certifying? And I know we addressed some of this in our materials, but
yeah, so there's two different things here. I mean, the validation and verification costs for projects are typically below $500,000. I'd expect they'd be in the $200,000 to $300,000 range, and that's a fixed cost independent of project size. So we felt that the first 5,000 hectares we certified in Sierra Leone was sort of a minimum size to justify that cost. But the way that PDD is being written is it's programmatic. So if we take that first 5,000 hectares and we expand it to the full 57,000 hectares that we have under management, we can take that same original validation document and use it across the entire area. And we can do the same thing with mangroves. So you sort of start with a minimum size you think is viable, and you take a programmatic approach where you say, you know, we're going to cover a much larger area by the time the project is done. And that makes it viable. People will do validation work for 1,000 to 2,000 hectares. Where you've got incredibly productive systems like mangrove conservation, it would probably make sense to do that for as little as 1,000 to 2,000 hectares. But our ambitions are always much larger than that.
On that note, how much importance does KlimatX give to REDD forestry projects, red forestry projects, and is it economically worthwhile? So
we've looked a lot at red projects. So red projects for everyone else is where you're doing conservation of existing established, typically rainforest areas, although it can work in temperate forests as well. The current dynamic in the markets is that there's a lot of scrutiny of additionality. So you have to show that forest, if you didn't protect it, would have been cut down otherwise. And there's a very interesting article on the BBC this morning about how rates of deforestation are actually increasing against a baseline. A lot of that is in Brazil, but it's not as though we've ended deforestation. So you have to prove that the land otherwise would have been cut down. That's the additionality test. That takes more time. It's potentially more expensive to do. The market has turned a little bit against red projects for now, so prices are down. And our networks of buying, even when we look at the mangrove projects, have a preference for restoration over conservation projects. To me, it's a bit of a perverse outcome because there's far more emissions globally coming from deforestation than from degraded land. So we don't want to be in a sort of perverse situation where we have to wait for everyone to cut down the trees before we can restore them. We're very actively committed to the idea that we solve these issues of additionality, and then we should be doing very, very large scale investment into conservation projects. Typically for conservation projects, the revenue share with government is much larger because it's often crown land. And what you're doing is, you're setting a price for carbon that compensates the landowner for the lost income from palm oil or soybeans or anything else, or timber, even anything like that. So the beauty of RED projects is they can be done on a very large scale. We think there's up to 2 million hectares in Sierra Leone that we could work on. The prices may be below $10 a ton, which is well below what we're getting, but you don't have a lot of capex. You're not having to do replanting. So the margins on those projects can still be very good as long as you do them at scale and as long as you work with the government.
On that, on the factor around pricing and value, what's the biggest factor you think that will increase the value of a given carbon credit project in one of our reforestation projects? I assume they mean.
Yeah, so we're getting premiums, and I can't disclose the exact pricing on the contracts, but it's above 10. Let's say it's above $10 a ton, and you could work that out from the release if you had a calculator. But the biggest factor driving pricing right now is there's a real premium on mangrove projects. There was an auction of 50,000 tons through KlimatX last week that sold for over $29 US a ton for mangrove conservation projects. So we see a strong selection of those types of projects. We see strong selection for afforestation and rewilding projects of the type that we're doing. We see buyers who are not interested in doing non-native species or commercial plantations. They want to see native species. And people want to see community and biodiversity benefits. So all of those, in terms of our customer base, add up to real premiums on the project. I would say in forestry, restoration trumps conservation by a very significant factor at the moment. And when you're in that territory, then they want to see the biodiversity value as well.
Perfect. Question from Adam Long. He's got a couple here. How many projects do you expect to close over the next 6 months and then next year, would you say?
I expect we'll very quickly see the upgrade on the Sierra Leone first 5,000 hectares with this first buyer to the full 20,000 hectares. So I think we'll see that in the next quarter. I think we'll see an initial close on the mangrove conservation project in the next quarter. I think we'll see before the end of the year a transaction on the Yucatan restoration project. I think we'll add in at least one more jurisdiction in the second half of this year that's going to be both conservation and restoration work. I think with Suriname, we'll have completed the field work by the end of the summer, and we'll be able to talk about a draft PDD and expect to get some funding for that early in 2024. So across those areas, I think we're going to have a lot of activity in the coming months. This has sort of opened the floodgates in terms of interest in our project pipeline. There were some of the other funders who are holding back because they didn't believe we could sell direct to one of the large corporates. A lot of the trading houses thought, we would need them to reach the market. And it turned out we've been able to do a pretty good job of reaching people without having to go through them, and probably on better terms than we would have got. So now we've got people banging on the door saying, how soon can we access these projects?
James, another question here. Beyond the initial credits that were bid on, and I assume talking about the latest release, what kind of talks with the winning bidder have taken place for additional projects in the future or credits? And I know some of that might be confidential.
No, I mean, we've been pretty open about this. I mean, we sliced and diced the project into 5,000 hectare blocks. That was 5,000 hectares was a good size and starting point. The company's preference is for that first 5,000 hectares to have a single investor into it, but that investor has to have some bid tension, so they're willing to pay at market rates, so we don't have to reopen that auction process. And we've achieved that by agreeing on an index for offtakes and pricing. That means, they're not getting a massive discount on it. For the other investors that have been in in the market. For the first investor, the first buyer, they obviously wanted to do everything in Sierra Leone and take on all of our projects. And we basically said, look, until we close the first transaction, you can't look at anything else. So we've obviously had some of the other bidders look at the 32,000 hectares and the mangrove projects as well. So what we don't want to do is end up, overcommitting to a single buyer and losing that competitive pricing pressure. So we're keeping that alive, and we've been, definitely trying to work through that. In terms of what the winning bidder gets within the contract, I think we announced this, that they have a ROFO on the other 20,000 hectares within that first project area. So we expect to complete that process pretty quickly.
Perfect. We have another question here from Ryan, who asks, I'm inquiring if the credits have been entered on either the GS or Vera registries yet, or what registries will you be entering on, and the anticipated per ton unit cost to the offsets, which you already kind of covered. So it's more about if the credits have been entered into a registry yet.
So they're entered into the Vera registry. They're in the technical review process now within the registry. You should be able to see that there's a registration for the Sierra Leone project, but you won't necessarily be able to see the technical documents until Vera has reviewed them. We'll primarily use Vera for now. Gold Standard is more for renewable and technology projects, and Vera is really the established leader in afforestation and reforestation and RED projects. And I should say as well, the registries have been coming under a lot of scrutiny. What I can tell you from our interactions with buyers is nobody is walking away from Vera as the global standard. All standards in financial accounting change and evolve over time. All of them have problems that need to be fixed. We still have very high confidence in Vera. It's certainly what the buyers look for us to develop projects to. And the biggest issue from a developer's perspective hasn't been quality control. It's actually been the response time from Vera and the processing time for projects. And we're putting a lot of pressure on them to improve that so that we get, we don't have long periods of dead time waiting for them to do technical review. I'd rather pay Vera more money on the transaction fees per ton and to know that we have capacity there, because it's it's all carrying costs for the project. So yeah, we have very high confidence in Vera. They're doing lots of upgrades to the protocols. They are the global standard for these types of projects, and I don't see any signs from the buyers that there's any change in sentiment about them being the trusted registry.
Excellent. On the countries, the host jurisdictions that the offsets can be, do you do an agreement with the host jurisdictions that the offsets can be retired outside of the host country, and that the offsets are not part of the host country's NDCs? Yeah,
so the NDCs are the country's nationally declared commitments, which is the commitments countries make to reduce their emissions under the UN agreement, what gets negotiated at COP every year. Most developing countries have not made clear NDC commitments. Most of the places we're operating, frankly, hadn't even really thought about it. They see themselves as being recipients of funding, and financing, and they're not particularly worried about reducing their emissions per capita at this stage. That said, we do talk to the national governments, we do address NDCs, we do have agreements in place to make sure that anything that we produce from a voluntary market perspective can't then be sold a second time under the UN trading framework. It's a bit of a red herring in some ways as well, because the system isn't even set up properly yet. And if we waited for the UN to resolve that before we did any investing, then we'd be waiting another 5 years probably before that gets up and running. So we've taken a kind of pragmatic approach, and our customers accept that we need to address NDCs, but we're not going to wait for the UN to grind through that process to start making investments.
There's a great question. Knowing how quickly KlimatX has been able to get up and running and actually sell one of your projects in 2 years from being a public entity is pretty incredible. Steve J asks, knowing who is bidding, would KLX shorten that bidding process by just going direct to 2 to 3 bidders to speed up the next tender process or the next sale?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we're actually less than 1 year since we actually listed the company. So we've been working on some of these projects for a bit longer, but we only listed at in July of last year. And so this runway, this activity is less than 12 months to get to this stage. And our mangrove projects in Sierra Leone, we didn't start working on until last November. And we did some planting in December just to test the area, but we're about 7 months into that project as well. So we're able to move really fast. And we think that that's really important to show that we can get boots on the ground and get things moving. I think we will shorten, well, let me put this another, we'll definitely shorten the process next time. There's a lot more competitive pressure now from the other buyers who recognize that we were able to do a deal without them. I think a number of them sat back and thought we weren't going to get it across the line, and we did. So we'll have a much more aggressive time frame. I'm not minded particularly to reduce the number. I think we can see from the deal room who was really active within it. What we may do is put some fees in place, option fees to participate in both rounds, both the initial due diligence and the completed round, because it doesn't cost companies money to waste our time asking lots of questions right now. And it does absorb a lot of our time as a small business. So we are thinking about how to make that more efficient. My expectation is we're very quickly now going to see alternative offers on the other project sites, having closed this first one. Saul, you had a question about drone and satellite tracking for traceability. Is there any consideration to utilize blockchain technology to tokenize these natural resources? It's difficult to use blockchain when you've got a registry that isn't set up to reconcile with blockchain. So the Vera registry is just a static database. It serializes every ton that's produced, and that can then be retired in the name of the buyer. These aren't transactions, these aren't commodities that are highly fungible and exchanged and traded lots of times the way that other commodities might be. So blockchain doesn't solve an immediate problem of sort of speed or traceability, because typically you produce a project, one person buys it and then they retire it. Where there is potential applications of blockchain is actually more in tracking things like the growth of trees, the contracts with smallholders, so that there's a clear low-cost contract ownership between the smallholders, the locations of the trees, all built into a registry and a ledger. We have been looking at that with a technology provider to see if that's better than what we need. I'm a little bit skeptical of blockchain, mostly because explaining carbon is already hard enough. Explaining how carbon and blockchain might work together generally generates an awful lot of eye rolling. And so, if we see a problem that blockchain can fix, we'll use it, but we're not rushing into that at this stage. Much more important is some of the new satellite imagery that's being developed by companies like Earth Daily, who are going to do daily 22-band hyperspectral satellite coverage, a huge upgrade on what's available from Planet. So you'll be able to see the trees, the planting areas, check moisture, irrigation, methane leakage every single day. And for us, that's a huge upgrade in the digital infrastructure.
That's amazing. Eric asks, is KLX able to compete in finding projects with many privately funded entities trying to start their own carbon projects? What's the advantage of, say, the access that your KLX is getting to these projects, I guess is what it means.
I mean, it's interesting when you think about competition in a space where you're expecting 15-fold growth in the amount of demand in the market. Like, I don't lose any sleep over competitors for the most part, because the scale of increase in demand is so massive that anyone who can develop a high quality project is welcome to bring it to the market. And they're very unlikely to, bump us out of the way because they've got a faster moving or a better project. Our kind of rules of engagement for projects are, we're not a passive investor. We have line of sight to ownership and to being an owner operator, or we are the owner operator. We think that gives us a big advantage in terms of quality control. So we work in places where we've got very well established economic and political relationships and a strong track record. If we acquire other projects or other companies, it would be on the basis of those companies having that same kind of footprint in those jurisdictions. So, once you frame it that way, we're in places where we're really strong and we're almost the exclusive operator in that country. And we look to sign agreements that are exclusive, as we did with the Suriname government to develop those projects. And then if we're in Suriname and somebody else wants to be in French Guiana or in Brazil or in Venezuela, I don't lose any sleep over that, because within each country, the scale we can get to is enormous already. And the same in West Africa. We're the big presence there. We dominate and have very strong relationships with the government there. So we just kind of get on with getting as big as we can within the areas where we've got very strong quality control.
Question here from Steve J. You've mentioned a private placement in past calls. Any update on that? And just wondering if investors are able to get involved.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense for us to look at a private placement now or over the next couple of months, really, because having proved out our pipeline of projects and shown that we can transact, our first big transaction, we want to be able to move as quickly as we can on de-risking our other projects to the stage where we can sell them. So, some of it's driven by market sentiment. We're not in a huge rush or a pinch point, but if a lead investor steps forward with an interest in leading it, then we'll definitely look at it, and we'll make any announcements as we proceed towards that. But the funding that we get for the Sierra Leone project, the pre-purchase, means we never spend another dollar on Sierra Leone on the first 5,000 hectares. So that does free up our capital to be able to do more project development. I'd like to see us, accelerate the pace at which we can de-risk those projects, and we will need to raise some capital to do that. So we'll have to just share that as and when we've made the decision to pull the trigger on that.
I think that's just about it. More on the, can you expand a little bit on de-risking projects that you've mentioned before? More about their option strategy for the buyer, the recent buyer in recent news, just a little.
So de-risking the projects really means, ideally, you've got a full draft project design document or a full project design document. And that's a reserve statement that clarifies everything around land title, land ownership, the underlying scientific models of carbon sequestration, and avoided emissions, the business model, the species mix, everything in that. And de-risking it means sort of eliminating all the uncertainties around that. Now, there's, between a draft PDD and the finished PDD can be several months of delays because, you have to get into country, the validator has to go in. What we found is with the sophisticated buyers, they have in-house teams who, almost do a sort of corporate validation or in-house validation of the projects. That's been very important for us in terms of quality control. And if they feel we've eliminated most of the risks, then we think we're in pretty good shape. In terms of the options for purchasing the remaining tons, the only option the current buyer has is with respect to the first 25,000 hectares. They have the right to step up and present an offer for the remaining 20,000 hectares. And I think we agreed something like a 30-day response period for managing that. But there's a good reason to want to have a single buyer for one project area. Otherwise, if you've got multiple parties funding it through a pre-purchase, then everyone's wondering if someone else is getting the tons delivered first. Whereas if you have a single buyer and you have market pricing, then that you've got one counterparty to deal with. So that's been the approach.
That's great. Does anyone else have any other questions? I don't see any more here, and I think we've addressed the ones that were sent via email. I would encourage everyone that if you haven't already signed up to subscribe to our monthly newsletter and to receive all the latest news. We're not going to go quiet this summer. As James mentioned, we have a lot of activities, so there'll be a good, healthy flow of news. And to subscribe to our YouTube channels where you can watch all of our events. We do record and produce videos for those. Anything else you want to add, James, to sign off here?
No, I mean, just that the support from these networks through these events and our investor following is very strong. You guys have seen the sort of level of trading we're getting every day and the attention to the stock. It's a very odd time in the market when you have the kind of volume that we have. The volume of trading of the stock, and it's just we expect to see the share price move up as we always hope for, but I just want to thank all the people here who are supporting the stock and continue to do that. Be patient, and we've turned over something like 45 million shares since we were listed, so lots of changes in ownership, lots of support. We're seeing very strong support from Europe as well, which has been great to see. And we think it's, as we strengthen and reinforce the ESG and impact story, we think we're going to have a really strong following, and people who believe in what we're doing. So appreciate you spending time here, and please reach out anytime if you have questions.
It's incredible what you've done in a year, not 2 years, 1 year.
1 year.
So, thank you so much too for everyone for attending and fielding your questions and sending us emails. Sarah's put up the link there to subscribe to our mailing list, and the link for our YouTube channel. We, of course, are on all the social channels. Thank you all for taking the time. One last question we'll ask you, James. Any hope or thought about listing in the US, OTC ticker?
Yeah, we expect to do that through the summer, and we expect to list in Germany as well through the summer. So complete that process. I don't think there's anything particularly proprietary or private about that. It's a sort of natural next step for us. So we'll initiate that process soon and make some announcements around it.
Okay, great.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful week. Thanks, James.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.
Bye.